I think what offends people, and this is where lawyers may be acting within the letter of the law, but are pushing the tolerance of the British people to the limits, is when we start saying in hearing that a number of migrants, not just one or two, are objecting going onto this barge off Portland because they're frightened of water. You know, that sort of thing really does begin to test people's patience.
Let's turn to Stop the Boats Week, shall we?
Do we have to?
It has set sail. There have been a few, rough seas along the way. You can insert your own nautical references here. I want to talk about lawyers particularly and the government's crackdown on immigration lawyers who help migrants fabricate fraudulent asylum claims. They're being threatened with life in jail. Let's have a listen first to Conservative MP Sir John Hayes, who claims that there are a number of lawyers, quite a large number in his estimation, gaming the asylum system.
What they do is to encourage people to deceive the authorities. They're encouraged to say they were trafficked when they weren't. They're encouraged to say they were fearing persecution when they're not. They are encouraging economic migrants to pretend they're legitimate asylum seekers. Now, that's a pretty low thing to do, and it can't be sustained. So the task force will uncover the numbers. I don't know what that number is going to be, but I suspect it'll be a lot more than the 7 that were prosecuted one year and the 5 the next. Imagine if that 7 were dealing with scores of migration cases. They would have been, certainly, each, and that number doubles. We may be dealing with many, many hundreds of people who are abusing the system. Now, that's not right. It's not acceptable. It's not fair, and it's got to be cracked down on.
Next then to the president of the Law Society, who is Lubna Shuja, who doesn't accept that this should be the government's focus.
This is actually detracting from the real issue here, which is that there are huge backlogs in the asylum system with the number of asylum cases that are outstanding. We have over 100,000 asylum cases outstanding, which are taking over a year to be processed. That's where the government needs to be directing its attention. That's where the government needs to put its focus, because those cases need to be dealt with a lot quicker. They're taking far too long, and they are costing taxpayers money at the moment.
So, Tim, a crackdown on so-called lefty lawyers, to use the easy phrase. The evidence suggests the government hasn't actually found that many of them over the last couple of years. 5 convicted last year, 7 in 2021. But Sir John Hayes saying, well, there's more to be uncovered, and that's the point.
Well, none of us know, really. The Daily Mail's investigation, which did lead to some of these lawyers being struck off in the last few days, is good for everyone, because the legal profession does not want to think that there are bad apples within their midst. I suspect what we have more of a problem of is lawyers just going that extra mile to represent their cases at the extremes, which is perfectly lawful and nothing that should be strikeable, offable of that, to invent an expression. But that is, of course, something that still offends, I think, most British people. You know, the fact that every migrant deserves basic legal representation. I think anyone who has a humanitarian bone in their body would support that. But I think there's just this feeling that British people who struggle often to get legal aid for their own circumstances, who are already offended by the huge amounts of money that are being spent on hotels. Let's not forget, it's £5 million per day that British taxpayers are spending on putting migrants in hotel accommodation. The idea that what most people, I think are perfectly reasonable measures to deport people to Rwanda, to put people on this barge in off the Dorset coast at the moment. The idea that lawyers are expensively being paid by those same taxpayers to avoid those sorts of measures which people think are reasonable. That's the issue. And I think actually some of what Sir John Hayes said was a distraction from that. I don't think we should exaggerate the what lawyers are doing. Just to talk about what they are doing is enough to, I think, cause legitimate offence and wonder whether we're spending our taxpayers' money wisely.
I think the numbers point is really important. You had the Law Society representative there pointing out that there are 100,000 cases that are taking a very long time to be heard, and John Hayes' top estimate was a couple of hundred migrants may have been granted asylum through these means. It's a very, very small percentage, and 5 and 7, they're not big numbers. I think I'm just very uncomfortable with this idea that there are some people who are deserving of legal representation, full legal representation, not talking about lawyers who are breaking the law. And obviously I agree entirely with Tim and John Hayes, weirdly, that is completely unacceptable.
We'll write that down.
We won't tell anyone, Rachel, don't worry.
It's not this is going out on live radio. But the point about a functioning legal system is that everyone gets representation, whether they are an asylum seeker or whether they are accused of mass murder or whether they are wrongly accused of a crime and they need that help, whether they are indeed the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We paid Boris Johnson's lawyers in the sort of Partygate WhatsApp messages scandal, and we paid for them twice, I believe. And this idea that lawyers who are representing people that the government doesn't like are lefty lawyers and therefore kind of doing something unpatriotic, I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. I also think it's worth sort of pointing out that a lot of the Conservative MPs who say this or who make these points about lefty lawyers or lefty legal structures that mean the governments can't do what they want, like the European Court of Human Rights, for example, are very happy to invoke such things and hire lawyers when it's them who are facing legal action. I remember Owen Paterson, who railed against the European Court of Human Rights, then going to it and appealing to it because of the way that his case when he was disbarred from Parliament or the way that kind of fell out. And Steve Baker, somebody else who hated it during the lockdowns.
Can I come back a little bit on this before you go through all the Tory MPs who may have been slightly hypocritical on this issue? And I'm mainly because I
had a list, Tim. I did research.
Because I don't want to tackle you on that because you're on relatively firm ground. But talking about not being so much on firm ground, talking about being on watery ground. Look, what you say, Rachel, is right. And there will definitely be some migrants who cross the channel, and that whole experience of crossing a very dangerous, the busiest waterway in the world, will be traumatised by the fact that they travelled on that journey. But I think what offends people, and this is where lawyers may be acting within the letter of the law, but are pushing the tolerance of the British people to the limits, is when we start saying in hearing that a number of migrants, not just one or two, are objecting going onto this barge off Portland because they're frightened of water. You know, that sort of thing really does begin to test people's patience. I think, we're one of the most generous countries in the world when it comes to the overseas aid budget. I think when we know that a migrant has come to Britain genuinely fleeing persecution, I think the British people are open and receptive to that. But when they hear their sort of hospitality being offended in that way by what are lawyerly schemes, legal, but I would say lawyerly schemes, that's when the legal profession is actually not helping the people they purport to represent, actually, and are undermining confidence in a system which is very important we do have confidence in, because if we don't, we won't be welcoming the really legitimate migrants.
I think the thing with the barge, though, is that the government's sort of trying to say two things about it that seem to be in conflict. That on the one hand, it's perfectly acceptable accommodation strategy, and there's nothing wrong with it. And anyone who's complaining that they've got they've doubled the amount of capacity and that there is very little space for any kind of socialization outside of these very, very small cabins is being sort of completely unreasonable. It's perfectly fine. It's not a prison barge. And yet at the same time saying, yeah, we hope that these conditions act as a deterrent to stop more people crossing. I think they sort of they're making the argument for their opponents there by saying themselves that this accommodation really is substandard and is something that people should want to avoid. And I'm not sure their messaging on that is particularly clear.
I think it is possible to combine giving migrants a basic standard of accommodation and it not being that attractive so that it acts as a deterrent. I don't think those two things are impossible to combine.
The Sun spoke to the first person off the barge today for a trip. I can't remember where he was going. It was an Iranian man, and he said, yeah, it was okay, I quite like it. Is what he said, and then a charity worker pulled him away saying don't speak to the press. By the sound of the report in the Sun
no,
today.
of course it's true. It isn't. I know why Rachel was described as a prison barge. It certainly wouldn't be somewhere I would like to live.
Yeah.
But people can get an on and off. The migrants there can get on and off when they choose to, and visit what is a very nice locality, much to the annoyance of some of the people.
The locals aren't too happy about that.
No, indeed, the local concerns continue.